The ghost's steps closed in behind me, each one like a ticking clock. My lungs burned as I ran, yet the space between us kept shrinking. Its faceless stare locked on me, a silent promise that the chase was almost over. The air split with a flash. The blade meant for me stopped mid-swing. A towering man stood in its path, muscles coiled like steel, eyes glowing in the haze. Behind him, I gasped for breath. Before him, the ghost twisted in frustration. No one knew who he was, but the darkness seemed to recognize an enemy it could not easily claim. It was just past midnight when I stepped off the late bus at the edge of a small Nevada town. The station was nothing more than a dimly lit shelter beside a cracked parking lot. My backpack felt heavier than it should as I adjusted my glasses and pulled my jacket closer. I planned to walk to the motel 2 blocks away, but the road was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. Across the street stood an old roadside shrine, its paint flaking, offerings long gone. Something about it drew my attention, a faint shimmer in the air around it like heat over asphalt. The sound came first, a slow dragging step from behind the shrine. A tall figure emerged, its face pale and smooth like melted wax, eyes black and wet as though they were crying shadows. The air around it turned cold enough to sting my skin. I froze, my mind trying to make sense of it, but the figure tilted its head and started toward me. Every step it took made the air tighten in my chest. I turned and ran, my boots hitting the pavement hard, my breath sharp in my throat. It followed without haste, yet it was always closer than it should have been. I cut through an alley, thinking I could lose it, but the walls rippled and shifted. My legs faltered as the street ahead dissolved into a foggy field scattered with white stones. The air smelled of smoke and iron. I realized too late I was no longer in the present. A line of crude wooden crosses stretched ahead, and figures in tattered uniforms lay still against the earth. The ghost behind me had followed through, its form now ragged, pieces of its chest blackened as if burned, hair drifting weightless like it was underwater. I stumbled over a grave marker, and it was almost on me when a burst of pale light cut between us. A man stood there, tall and broad, wearing dark armor etched with strange patterns. His eyes glowed white in the mist as he raised a massive shield. The ghost recoiled, its form twisting. He didn't speak, only moved forward with a calm certainty, forcing it back. I could feel the heat of the light against my face as I crawled away from them, my knees sinking into the damp ground. A hand gripped my arm, another figure pulling me to my feet. She was young, dirt on her cheeks, her long braid frayed, dressed in clothes decades older than mine. Without a word, she led me toward a cluster of tents lit by low lanterns. The ghost let out a soundless scream before fading into the mist. The armored man stayed behind, his figure slowly swallowed by the fog as if he belonged to it. My chest ached with every breath, but I kept moving with the girl, unsure if I was safe. Somewhere in that silent field, the air shifted again, and I knew I might not be done with whatever had followed me here. I thought the light would fade once the ghost stepped back, but it lingered in the mist like a quiet warning. The man with the shield did not turn to look at me. His stance was steady, as if he had been standing in this field long before I arrived. My chest rose and fell too fast, and the cold air stung my throat. The girl who had pulled me from the ground kept a firm grip on my sleeve. We passed between the tents, their canvas flapping in a wind I could not feel. Faces peeked from the shadows. Men and women dressed in worn uniforms, their expressions caught between curiosity and suspicion. One tall man with dark hair and a scar over his brow stepped closer, his gaze locking on me. His eyes flicked to the armored figure in the distance, then back to mine, and something unspoken passed between us. The girl guiding me whispered her name was Alice, though her voice trembled like she was unsure I should know it. She led me toward a low fire where another woman sat, mending what looked like strips of old leather. The woman's eyes scanned me in silence before she offered a seat on a rough wooden crate. I lowered myself onto it, my hands still shaking. A sudden shout drew my head around. The armored man was gone, the mist swallowing the space where he had stood. The ghost's form rippled in the distance, no longer solid, but still present. It slid between the crosses like a shadow slipping underwater. The scarred man from before picked up a lantern and stepped forward, his posture tense. Alice leaned in and said this place was not meant for strangers. She said people who appeared here never stayed long, not because they chose to leave, but because something took them. I swallowed hard, my mind searching for a reason, a loophole, anything that could explain why I was here. My last memory before this was a quiet bus station. Now the air smelled of smoke and damp earth, and the night seemed too heavy. A figure approached the fire, a man with sandy hair and a calm face, though his clothes were streaked with mud. He crouched down beside me and asked if I had seen the ghost up close. I nodded before I could think, and his jaw tightened. He said it had been following the camp for nights, but never this close. The woman by the fire stopped mending her leather and looked toward the fog. She said in a low voice that if the armored man had stepped in, it meant the ghost had crossed some line. No one replied. The silence stretched, broken only by the low crackle of the fire. Then the air shifted again. A cold rush swept through the camp, extinguishing 2 of the lanterns. The sandy-haired man rose in one motion, scanning the edges of the mist. Shapes moved beyond the crosses, faint and flickering, like memories half-formed. Alice took my hand again, her grip almost painful. From the fog, the armored man emerged once more, but this time he was not alone. Another figure walked beside him, tall and slender, wrapped in a cloak so dark it seemed to pull the light in. The ghost shrank back as they approached, its edges breaking apart like smoke and wind. The scarred man stepped forward, placing himself between the camp and whatever was coming. His voice was calm, but there was a strain under it as he told the others to be ready. I felt my pulse in my ears, my thoughts scattered. I should run, but there was nowhere to go that was not already wrapped in fog. The cloaked figure paused just before the firelight reached them. I could not see their face, but their presence pressed against me like a heavy tide. The armored man stopped at their side, and for a moment, no one moved. The ghost swayed in the distance, caught between retreat and attack. Then it happened fast. The cloaked figure raised a hand, and the fog churned. The ghost let out a soundless recoil, its form scattering into the mist until it vanished. The cold lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt just as wrong. The cloaked figure turned, their gaze sweeping over the camp before settling on me. Something in that unseen stare told me they knew exactly how I had come here, and why I might not be able to leave. My throat felt dry, but I could not speak. The armored man's head tilted slightly, as if waiting for me to understand some silent message. Alice let go of my hand and stepped back. The sandy-haired man lowered the lantern. The fire crackled once, sending a thin line of sparks into the dark. I wanted to believe it was over, but the weight in the air said otherwise. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the crosses and the fog, I felt the faintest echo of those dragging steps return. I barely slept that night. The fire burned low, casting restless shapes on the canvas walls. Every crackle sounded like movement just outside, and my mind kept replaying the way the cloaked figure had looked at me. Alice stayed nearby, but her eyes never really closed. Across the camp, the scarred man paced slow circles, his lantern swinging like a patient clock. At some point, I thought I saw the armored man again, far off at the edge of the mist, unmoving. It could have been my imagination, or the shadows making a shape they shouldn't. The air felt heavier the longer I stared. Eventually, I lay back down, but the ground seemed colder, as if the earth itself had been disturbed. When dawn came, the camp was already stirring. The sandy-haired man was speaking to a young woman I hadn't met before, her hair pulled into a loose braid, her face pale from the chill. She glanced at me briefly, then returned to her quiet conversation. Alice handed me a cup of something hot, the steam carrying a faint scent of mint. It didn't chase away the tension. The scarred man gathered a small group and motioned for me to follow. We left the camp in single file, the mist trailing us like it wanted to keep up. The ground gave way to uneven stone, and my boots scraped against it with a sound far too loud for the silence around us. No birds, no wind, only the steady rhythm of our steps. Alice walked just behind me, her presence both comforting and unsettling. She said we were heading toward the old markers, places where the fog seemed to hold back. The sandy-haired man explained they were boundaries of some kind, though he spoke like he wasn't sure they still worked. I asked what they were meant to keep out. He didn't answer. We reached a clearing with 3 weathered stones arranged in a rough triangle. They were covered in carvings I couldn't read, shapes that shifted slightly if I stared too long. The air here was different, lighter, yet edged with something sharp beneath the calm. The scarred man circled the stones, running his fingers over the carvings as if checking for changes. That's when I felt it. A soft pull, like an invisible thread wrapping around my wrist. It wasn't painful, but it was persistent. I looked down and saw nothing there. Alice's eyes narrowed as she watched me, and she asked in a low voice if I felt the tug. I nodded. Her hand tightened on my arm, and she told me not to follow it. The pull grew stronger, like it was leading me toward the mist just beyond the stones. I took a step before realizing I'd moved at all. The sandy-haired man blocked my path, his expression unreadable. He said if I crossed the boundary without understanding it, I might not find my way back. I asked where it would take me. His answer was only a glance toward the fog. The cloaked figure appeared again at the edge of sight, just beyond the carvings. No movement, only presence. The armored man stood beside them, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of something strapped to his side. Not a weapon I could name, but it caught the light in a strange way. The ghost was nowhere to be seen. The scarred man called out, his tone careful, almost formal. The cloaked figure didn't respond. Instead, the pull on my wrist released, leaving a faint warmth in its place. The armored man turned his head slightly, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I felt his focus on me. The next moment, both figures stepped back into the mist, and the air in the clearing loosened. We returned to the camp in silence. The young woman with the braid was waiting, her hands folded as if she'd been standing there for some time. She looked at the scarred man, then at me, and said quietly that the boundary wouldn't hold forever. The words landed heavier than I wanted them to. That night, I sat by the fire with Alice and the sandy-haired man. He spoke of a time before the fog, when the markers were still strong and no strangers arrived unannounced. I asked him what changed. He said the first crack in the boundary came when someone followed the pull and never returned. I asked what happened to them. His eyes stayed on the flames. As I lay down, the warmth of the fire fading, I couldn't shake the thought that the pull had chosen me for a reason. The air outside the tent was still, but I could feel the faintest echo of it again, curling around my wrist, patient and waiting. By the third morning, the fog felt different, not heavier but closer, curling low around our ankles as we walked. I kept glancing behind, half expecting to see that same shadowed figure keeping pace, though the path behind us stayed empty. The sandy-haired man didn't speak much, but every so often he would stop and tilt his head like listening for something beyond our hearing. We were joined by another traveler, a tall woman with weather-worn skin and eyes the color of cold river water. She carried no visible pack, yet somehow seemed prepared for whatever lay ahead. Alice exchanged a few quiet words with her, though neither offered me an explanation. The scarred man led us into a narrow pass between jagged cliffs, where the air cooled enough to make my breath visible. Halfway through the pass, I noticed faint etchings on the stone, spirals and lines that seemed almost alive under the shifting light. The new woman ran her fingers over them, her brow tightening. She said the markings were fresher than they should be, as if someone had renewed them recently. I didn't ask who, because part of me didn't want to know. We emerged into a small valley scattered with crooked trees, their branches bent in the same direction, as though pushed by a single long breath. The mist pooled at the base of the trunks, hiding the ground. The scarred man stopped, raising one hand, and the group fell silent. There was a sound ahead, slow and deliberate, like fabric dragging across stone. From the fog stepped a figure I recognized immediately. Not the cloaked one, but the armored man who had blocked the strike before. His presence brought both relief and unease. He stood still for a long moment, then glanced toward the tree line. When I followed his gaze, I saw movement. The cloaked figure emerged, each step matched by a shift in the mist, and the space between them seemed to tense. The sandy-haired man whispered to the tall woman, and she stepped closer to me, her eyes never leaving the two figures. It felt like something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that none of us were meant to interrupt. The air thickened, every sound distant, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the armored man turned and walked toward me. His pace was unhurried, but I felt the weight of every step. He stopped just short of the boundary where the mist swirled around my boots. For a moment I thought he might speak, but instead he raised one hand, palm open, and a thin line of light traced itself across the air between us. The pull I'd felt before returned, stronger, threading through my chest instead of my wrist this time. I had the sense it wanted me to cross that glowing line, though I couldn't say why. The tall woman's hand tightened on my shoulder, grounding me. I stayed where I was, though the light shimmered like it was breathing. The cloaked figure tilted their head, a subtle shift that somehow felt like a challenge. The armored man lowered his hand, and the light dissolved into the mist. Without a word, he turned back toward the other figure, and they both stepped into the tree line until only the sound of leaves moving marked their passage. The valley seemed to exhale, and the normal sounds returned, the faint creak of branches, the distant drip of water. The scarred man signaled for us to move on, though his eyes lingered on the place where the two had vanished. As we left the valley, I kept looking over my shoulder, half hoping, half fearing they might follow. That night around the fire, the sandy-haired man finally spoke. He said the armored one had walked this land long before any of us, guarding paths that should never be crossed. I asked what would happen if someone ignored that guard. He didn't answer directly, only said the fog had a way of keeping what it took. Lying in the dark, I thought about the pull, the light, and the way my chest had ached when I resisted. I wondered how many more times I'd be tested before I understood why I was here, and whether I'd have the strength to refuse again when the mist called. Morning came slower than I expected, with the light filtered through clouds so thick they seemed painted across the sky. We left the valley in silence, each step muffled by damp earth. My thoughts kept circling back to that faint pull in my chest, the way it had lingered long after the armored man vanished into the trees. The tall woman walked beside me, her gaze flicking toward the horizon more than the trail ahead. She didn't say much, but the few words she shared felt deliberate, like she was measuring each before letting it out. The sandy-haired man kept ahead, speaking quietly with the scarred one. Their conversation was too low to hear, but the pauses between their words were telling. By midday, the path widened into a stretch of pale grass that moved like water under the wind. At the far end, an abandoned farmhouse leaned toward the east, its roof sagging under the weight of years. The others didn't rush toward it, but I felt drawn, as though the building had been waiting for us. Inside, dust hung in the air like frozen smoke. The furniture looked untouched, yet unsettled, chairs slightly turned from the table as though someone had just left. In one corner, a faded quilt covered a trunk. When I brushed it back, the fabric released a faint scent of lavender. The trunk opened easily, revealing neatly folded clothes in styles I didn't recognize. At the very bottom lay a small wooden box with an inlaid pattern of interlocking circles. I lifted it, feeling a faint vibration against my palms, like a low hum only my bones could hear. Before I could open it, the tall woman appeared at my shoulder. Her expression didn't change, but she took the box from me with surprising care. She said it needed to stay closed until the right place revealed itself. I didn't ask where that might be. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a sound I hadn't heard in days, voices. Not from our group, but distant and overlapping, as though coming from beyond the field itself. We stepped outside, and I saw them. Shapes moving along the horizon, too far to make out clearly, but their motion was wrong. The others noticed too. The scarred man's posture changed, a subtle shift that told me these shapes weren't new to him. The sandy-haired man told us to move quickly. The tall woman stayed close to me, one hand lightly touching my arm, as if to keep me anchored. Crossing the grass, I kept glancing back. The shapes were closer now, though I couldn't explain how. They didn't seem to move faster than us, yet the distance between us shrank. My chest tightened, and that same strange pull returned, stronger, more insistent. It didn't draw me toward the shapes, but toward something ahead, hidden beyond a rise in the land. When we reached the top of the hill, I saw it. A circle of stones half buried in the ground, each marked with spirals like the ones in the pass. Inside the circle, the air shimmered faintly, as though heat rose from it despite the cool wind. The armored man stood there, his back to us, facing the shapes that had been following. Without turning, he raised his arm toward me again, the same open palm, the same silent invitation. The tall woman's grip tightened. The sandy-haired man stepped between me and the circle, his voice low but firm, saying this wasn't the time. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the sound from behind us grew louder. Not footsteps, but a constant rustling, like dry leaves twisting over stone. The armored man lowered his arm, and the shimmer in the air dimmed. He stepped aside, letting the mist from the field curl into the stone circle. The shapes at the horizon slowed. For a moment, I thought they might turn back, but instead they stopped entirely, as if something unseen had bound them in place. Then, one by one, they sank into the mist, fading until nothing remained. The armored man glanced at us only once before stepping backward into the shimmer and vanishing. The air stilled. We left the hill quickly. No one spoke until the farmhouse was out of sight. That night, camped near a creek, I sat apart from the others, turning the day over in my mind. I thought of the box in the tall woman's possession, the way the armored man had seemed to wait for me, and the strange stillness when the shapes disappeared. The water beside me reflected the faint glow of the stars, but for a moment I could swear it showed another sky entirely. Sleep came slowly. My dreams carried me back to the stone circle, only this time I was alone inside it, the spirals on the stones turning as if alive. Somewhere beyond the mist, a voice spoke my name, though it didn't sound like mine anymore. When I woke, the night was quiet, but the pull in my chest was stronger than ever. The creek's gentle sound stayed with me as we broke camp, though the air felt different that morning. It wasn't colder, but heavier, as if the world was leaning closer to listen. The others moved with quiet urgency, their glances shifting between the trees and the open stretches ahead. I kept thinking about the dream, the spirals turning on their own. Part of me wanted to believe it was only my mind twisting memories, yet there was a lingering certainty that it had been more. The tall woman seemed to sense my thoughts, walking near enough for her presence to steady me without words. We reached a narrow pass lined with moss-covered stone, the kind that absorbs sound until footsteps feel too loud. In the distance, faint chimes rang, irregular and soft, like they were carried from somewhere far away. The sandy-haired man slowed, scanning the cliffs above, while the scarred one moved ahead without hesitation. Halfway through, I noticed markings on the stones, carved deep and darkened by time. They weren't just spirals, but interwoven patterns, flowing into one another like pieces of a story too old to read. I traced one with my fingers, and a sudden warmth bloomed under my skin, as though the rock itself had a pulse. The moment I pulled away, the air shifted. A thin mist rolled across the ground, curling around our ankles before rising. Shapes moved inside it, not like the ones from the field, but smaller, faster, darting just at the edge of sight. The tall woman's hand rested briefly on my shoulder, guiding me forward without looking back. As the mist thickened, a figure emerged ahead, not the armored man this time, but someone younger, his features sharp and eyes pale as winter light. He stood in the center of the pass, unmoving, the chimes growing louder with every heartbeat. There was no malice in his gaze, only a strange recognition, as if he knew me already. The sandy-haired man stepped between us, his stance guarded but not hostile. Words passed between them in a language I didn't know, the sounds smooth and flowing, almost musical. The younger man's expression softened, but he shook his head slowly, pointing toward the cliff above before stepping back into the mist. We continued through, and the chimes faded. I looked up to where he had pointed, seeing a faint glow near the top of the cliff. The scarred man was already climbing, his movements sure and practiced. When he reached the ledge, he pulled something from the stone, a small disc of metal etched with the same patterns as the pass. That night, we made camp in a clearing ringed with tall grass. The air was still, but the silence wasn't empty. It was the kind that made you aware of every breath, every rustle in the distance. The tall woman sat across from me, the wooden box in her lap. She didn't open it, only ran her fingers along its edges, as though listening for something hidden inside. The scarred man placed the disc beside her, and for the first time, I saw her expression shift. She looked at me then, a brief glance that carried weight I couldn't name. The sandy-haired man broke the moment by tossing a small bundle of herbs into the fire, sending a sharp scent through the air. Later, lying awake, I thought about the people we had met, the silent figure in the mist, the armored man, the shapes that seemed to follow from one place to the next. None had given answers, yet each encounter felt like a step along a path I couldn't see in full. My chest still carried that faint pull, stronger with every passing day. Just before sleep found me, I caught movement at the edge of the clearing. A faint shimmer in the grass, barely taller than my knee, weaving slowly toward the center where the firelight didn't quite reach. I stayed still, watching as it paused, the patterns on its surface shifting like ripples in water. Then, without a sound, it faded into the night.